Today, I have the privilege of interviewing Philip Dow. Philip Dow is one of my, I would say, intellectual heroes, whether he realizes that or not, or would feel comfortable with that title. Philip's work has deeply impacted me from the first time that I heard him speak at an ACSI, Association of Christian Schools International Directors Conference years ago. And let me tell you a little bit about Philip. Philip is the head of Roslyn Academy, a school, an international school of about 650 students. Is that right, Phil? In Nairobi, Kenya, correct?
That's
and then, and you have served there really since around 2002, with about a 3-year break that he took to do his doctoral work at Cambridge University. And speaking of education, you have both your master's in philosophy and your PhD in the history of U.S. foreign relationships, from Cambridge University. He is a father to two, husband to Catherine Dow, and have been married since 2002 as well. So it looks like that happened around the time you began your journey at Roslyn as well. So anything I've missed about you?
No, that's a good summary. Thanks.
Okay, very good. But of course, he has also authored a number of publications, including, and the one that we'll be focusing on today, Virtuous Minds. Any of my students who are watching this right now know that at the beginning of several of my classes that in which students enter into study with me, they will be exposed to the concepts of virtuous minds. We talk about intellectual virtues and what it means to love the Lord with your mind, framed in the concepts in this book. And so I'm, obviously that's had a deep impact on me. It's had an impact on students. I've had students tell me that they've bought this book and that they are going through it as a book study with their friends. And so I'm very excited to have Philip here today to talk about intellectual virtues, this topic of intellectual virtues, and anything else that arises from our time together. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you.
Well, hey, for those who are not familiar with your book, can you introduce us to even the whole topic of intellectual virtues? Maybe tell us a little bit about how you got involved in studying it, and then introduce the topic and tell us about why it's so important.
Yeah, no, thanks, Tim. The story of how I got into or interested in intellectual virtue or intellectual character is a long one, so I'll try to make very brief. But I was teaching in Seattle, and one of my good friends who I'd met actually in England several years before was doing his PhD in philosophy at University of Washington. And he was doing it in an area of philosophy called virtue epistemology, which is a fancy way of saying intellectual virtue or intellectual character. And it was a new idea, a relatively new area in philosophy, a slowly growing area of philosophy, but really new. And as he was sharing with me what he was doing, I saw the huge implications of these ideas for Christians, for education, and for culture in any type of democratic or civic society. These ideas, the impact of our thinking habits on our life as Christians and as people in democracy, I thought was just immense. And so I was really struck by how important these ideas were. My friend's name is Jason Baer, and he is a professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount in LA now. And he helped start a school called Intellectual Virtues Academy in Long Beach. So,
wow.
So his ideas, as he's doing his PhD, I started saying, hey, there's a direct relevance to K through 12 education and through to higher education, as well as life in general. And so we started having a conversation about the application of the philosophy, kind of the high abstract concepts, and how they can be relevant to our lives. And so that led me to begin thinking about it in terms of education. And that dialogue led to, he finished his PhD, and I started thinking about it in terms of K through 12 education and life. And so that kind of collaboration really resulted in the book that you are referencing, that's Virtuous Minds. I'd actually encouraged him to write the book. I said, hey, there's a book that needs to be written for a general audience, so that people can get these ideas and start to apply them, especially as Christians. And the ideas are not necessarily only, these are applicable to anyone, whether you're a Christian or not. But as a Christian, they have particular resonance, because our aim is to love God with all of ourselves, including our minds. And to me, this was the most powerful expression of loving God with our minds that I had come across. My entire life, I had asked the question, what does it mean to love God with our minds? Does it mean just thinking the right things, and having not just wholesome but God-honoring thoughts? And I said, yes, it does. But this made me realize, no, there's a deeper level. It's about the habits, virtuous habits, God-honoring habits in our thinking, that ultimately have a much greater impact on our lives than simply trying to think in God-honoring content in a way.
Right.
Our habits lead to the content, not the other way around so much. So that's kind of how I got into the ideas, how I felt, how I saw the relevance of them, and then the rest is kind of trying to work those out and ask, how does this look in our lives and in education in particular?
It's interesting that you bring that up, and it's a great segue into the question, the second part of that question, which is, the introduction to the intellectual virtues. When I bring up the question, I always bring up the topic in my classes. I always ask students, what does it mean to love the Lord with our minds? We look at the Great Commandment, and we talk about how it's so easy to love the Lord with our heart, our soul, and our strength. But what does it mean to love the Lord with your mind? And I'm glad that students have this. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's interesting that the very first thing that comes up is, well, just making sure that your thoughts are pure and holy. Well, okay, like that's one aspect of it, but it's far deeper than that. And I guess that's what was so impacting to me about your work, is it gave a language for me to I hope you don't take this as any sort of offense, but there was nothing that I could say was new about what you shared. Like, these were all thoughts that I had had in more scattered ways or in pocketed thinking. I think the brilliance of great books sometimes is that, often in fact, is that they don't claim to present anything new, but they clarify things that we have already touched upon and wrestled with. And I just really feel like that's what Virtuous Minds did, and did so well, or does so well. So tell us a little bit, tell our audience, our listeners, a bit about intellectual virtues and why they are important.
Yeah. Tim, you're absolutely right in terms of these ideas. Intellectual character did not begin with the book Virtuous Minds, or with Jason Behr's PhD, or with Virtuous Epistemology. Intellectual character has been there as long as human beings have as long as as soon as God created the first human beings. Intellectual character is, we've had thinking habits, and we've had good ones and we've had bad ones, and thinking habits that are God-honoring and thinking habits that are not. So these are not new ideas at all. But you're right. What's been so valuable for Jason's work and now applied to what I'm doing is that it does give us a vocabulary to talk about these things, and to actually, you can't really grow in something if you don't understand it and don't have a language to surround it, to give a context. Or you can, but it's a lot harder. So let me try to define, because I think that's kind of the next question is, well, what is it? We started talking about it. What is intellectual character, intellectual virtue? And there's a number of definitions that I like, but a very simple one is that intellectual virtue are the thinking, the traits of a thinker who is pursuing the truth. Okay. So that's, and I think there's actually probably more helpful definitions in the book as well, but that's one that I like. So someone who is intellectually virtuous is someone whose thinking habits naturally result from a pursuit of truth. So think of it this way. If you say, I really want to get to the truth, and as Christians, that is what we should always be seeking to do. If I want to really get to the truth, what are the habits that would naturally lead me to the pursuit to truth? And I come up with a list of things that are in the book. For instance, intellectual tenacity. Okay, not giving up. Getting at the truth is hard, and it requires tenacity. It requires grit. So tenacity, carefulness. Not rushing over things, not but making sure that you're taking the time to flesh things out well. Humility, courage, fair-mindedness. These are habits that people who really pursue the truth will naturally start to accumulate. The problem is we don't always pursue the truth. We oftentimes have goals that are quite different from the truth. We may think that we are truth seekers, but really we're probably using truth to get to some other goals, whether it's wealth or popularity or career success or whatever it may be. So the question is, what is our ultimate goal? If, as Christians, our ultimate goal is to love God with our minds, then that's the pursuit of truth. And if that's our pursuit, and it's more important than even success in career, then these attributes will naturally result. So I just think about the contrast between intellectual fairness, let's say, and bias, tenacity and laziness, carefulness and carelessness, courage and the opposite of courage, whatever word is best for there. So that's one way to think of intellectual character or virtue, is that thinking habits that naturally result from a pursuit of truth. Another way to think of it, and I'll stop with this definition, is it is the filter or the framework through which all of our thinking happens. So our character, our intellectual character, we have become a certain type of thinker, and we have a certain set of traits that shape and color every thought that we have. So if we are a person of intellectual virtue, our natural autopilot is going to be an intellectually virtuous autopilot, and that is going to naturally lead us into truth in a way that if we didn't have those characteristics, we wouldn't. I'm not sure I've done a very good job, for having written a book on this. I'm not sure I did a very good job of giving you a definition, but those are some things that I think are helpful.
Yeah. No, I think you've done an excellent job, actually, of describing what intellectual character is, because really that's the goal of these virtues that your book enumerates. Ultimately, is in the development of these of the character of good thinking habits. I love this, by the way. I've really made a strong mental note of this to share that idea with my students. The idea that we often, our intellectual character often gets sidelined because what's at the core of our interest is not what's true. There is another agenda at the core of our interest that we're going to then bend reality to fit. Let's talk a little bit about, let's explore for a moment, because before people begin to think, well, is this all in some heady or intellectual realm and divorced from the practical? Can you describe sort of the practical implications that might transcend an academic setting?
And that's the irony. Whenever you put the word intellectual in front of anything, people assume that it's abstract and not relevant. Where actually the truth couldn't be further from the truth, in that intellectual virtue is, I think, the most practical thing that you can aspire to. Let me give you just a couple examples. Okay, intellectual virtue. These virtues. Let's say fair-mindedness. Our relationships. Okay, the most important thing in our life, outside of our relationship to God, is our relationship to others. Okay, so love God and love your neighbor as yourself. These are the two great commandments. And so you see, if there's nothing more practical than loving God and loving our neighbor well. So how do we love our neighbor well? And I'm realizing as I'm starting this, I'm going to go on a little bit of a journey here. So, but
fine.
Loving our neighbor is rooted in trust. Okay, so if our neighbor doesn't trust us, if our spouse or our friend doesn't trust us, or if we don't trust them, there's a broken relationship, and that relationship cannot produce fruit and cannot provide value and joy and all the things that come from this critical part of being a human. Okay, is our relationships. Our relationships are based on trust, And trust is based on being a person of intellectual virtue. You cannot be a trustworthy person if you are not practicing the virtues of fair-mindedness, for instance, or intellectual courage or intellectual tenacity. Okay, so what a fair-minded person does is they actually listen to the other person's perspective, regardless of narrative or other priorities. Okay, you mentioned, what is driving us. If our pursuit of if we're interested in the pursuit of truth, then we're going to listen well to our friend or our spouse or our enemy, for that matter. Okay, and as we do that, we are showing that person that they matter. Okay, that their perspective matters, and we're showing them that actually we are interested more in getting to the truth than we are in necessarily winning the argument. Okay, as we do that, there is a trust that is built because they're saying, hey, you know what? It's not about this person kind of dominating or pounding through their idea. It's about pursuing truth, and then they see you as a trustworthy person, and they start to listen to what you're going to say in a way that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise. So I don't know if that's a great example, but that would be one example where if you are not trustworthy, your relationships will have trouble succeeding, and if our relationships don't succeed, our lives are much less joyful, life-giving, fruitful. Let me give you another practical example that's a little less abstract, maybe. Let's say you're going in, and I use this example in the book. Let's say you're going into to get a mortgage for the first time, and this would be an example related to intellectual carefulness, which seems to be less important, but actually is a very important virtue. You're going in to get a mortgage, and it's a huge moment of your life. Buying a house is a big thing for all of us. Massive financial implications, massive life implications. You make a horrible financial decision, it trickles down and affects everything else. You go into debt, and it causes stress, and it just has a ripple effect. So a big decision. Okay, when you go in to get a mortgage, you will naturally need to ask some questions. But the person who has intellectual carefulness versus the person who's naturally intellectually careless will approach that meeting in a very different way. Okay, if you've developed habits of carefulness, checking your math twice, to make sure, reading the question to make sure that you got the question right, going over a sentence to make sure you understood someone, whatever it may be, if you have developed a habit of carefulness, okay, and let's say tenacity, you're going to go into that meeting, this mortgage meeting, with the ability, the natural ability, you don't even have to think about it, to ask good questions and to probe deeper, to be careful that you're getting the details right. The difference between a 3.1 interest rate and a 5.1 interest rate is a massive difference. So are you paying attention to that? Are you looking at the fine print in the mortgage deal that you're being offered, and so on? Are you asking the questions that are going to lead you to the fine print in a way? So if you have developed habits of carefulness and tenacity and courage, for instance, intellectual courage, tenacity, you're going to walk into that meeting armed with a whole host of traits that are going to let you get to a good decision. Okay. Right. Versus someone who doesn't, who says, I'm not used to asking good questions because I'm not careful in my thinking. I don't look for details. I'm not willing to admit that I don't know something, and so I ask a question. That takes courage. The person who has all these virtues is going to come, and they're going to make a better decision, period. Yeah. And when they make a better decision, that is going to have an impact throughout their life. It's going to lead to I guess you could say, to prosperity, because they won't be in debt. It leads to less stress. It leads to all these things that will naturally result from a good decision on a major decision like a house purchase. The person with intellectual virtue is going to be better equipped to do that. So that's kind of I guess a big decision. if you break it down, you say, well, the choice to be careful in math class over the last 15 years of your education is developing your ability to make a decision in a practical, life-changing moment like that. Where if you've neglected being careful in math or in grammar or whatever it is, you're going to come in less equipped when you need to make these decisions. So I talk about, not in the book, but talking about how in the classrooms and boardrooms of the world, in other words, it's the same character traits that you're developing in an academic environment that are going to translate to buying a house or to building a house, for that matter.
A very practical example I give too in the realm of relationships, because I love, I think especially with college-age students, you often see, of course, relational conflicts arise. And it is amazing how our flesh wants to so quickly rush to judgment.
Yes.
And I think that, intellectual carefulness, you mentioned in the book, you make a quote that says, "It is impossible to love your neighbor without being intellectually careful. Just try doing it," or something along those lines. I'm butchering your quote. But, I bring up to students, when somebody offends you, do you immediately go to, well, their motive was this, and clearly they mean this, or when you, especially if it's third-hand information, or a second-hand or third-hand information, right? Do you evaluate that? Do you sit and speak with a person? Do you try to get at the core of, what intention was versus what the impact was? Like having the carefulness to really go through that before you jump to any kind of conclusion can just radically alter the relationships in your life. And I love what you said too. I'm taking this away, how trust is built on that. And trust is obviously at the core of those relationships. So, wow, there's so many practical implications there. And by the way, one of the great quotes, and I can't believe that the name is escaping me, but it has to do with intellectual carefulness. Samuel Johnson, here it is. Yeah, sorry. "It is more from carelessness about truth than from intentionally lying that there is so much falsehood in the world."
Yeah.
And this was written in like the 1800s. So it's really fascinating to see how much more so that just how much, I know, how salient that quote is to our world today. And that's maybe a good segue into what particular needs do you see in the realm of intellectual virtue? We talked now at the personal level. Where are we failing in the church? Where are we failing in culture at large, in the realm of intellectual virtue and intellectual character?
So I think many of the faults that I see, or many of the weaknesses or flaws that I see in our culture at large, I see in the church as well. I don't think the church is I mean, we should be separate from the world. There should be a distinction. And I hope that actually by us as Christians, developing intellectual virtue, by loving God with our minds, we begin to be very dramatically different from the culture around us. But right now I see a lot of overlap, and oftentimes, Christians, we aren't perfect, right? We are flawed, sinful beings, and we lack some of the virtues that we know we should have. But so let me start with culture, and something that I see in culture, because I see the same tendencies oftentimes within Christians as well. And I mean, the easy one to pick on, but it is easy because it's so obvious, is the way that our media approaches the pursuit of pursuing the news of the day. Okay, how do they research their stories? How do they tell those stories? Is it narrative driven or is it truth driven? And it happens all the time where, and part of this is the pursuit of money, and and I don't want to oversimplify it, but media is driven by profit, of course. They have to pay the bills in a sense. So they want to have a dramatic story, and they want to have it before anyone else. Okay, so those two motives push the media, and this is on both sides or all sides of the media spectrum, to get a story out there before they have the facts verified. Or if they have a set of facts or data that seems to support them, they rush it without without being critical and without kind of asking questions about that data. And there's an immense number of examples in the last 4 or 5 years where the media have rushed to judgment only to be found later that they missed significantly important key facts that change the entire story. But what happens is the entire American public has a story that came out right away, and you can't walk back the fact that that is an inaccurate story. It's an untruthful story. And those you could say, well, are they dishonest? Do they mean to be dishonest? Well, the Samuel Johnson quote they started off with is a great example of this. Whether they meant it or not, the lack of carefulness, the lack of virtue, led them to tell a mistruth or a lie. And that lie has an impact. It impacts how people vote. It impacts foreign policy. It impacts economic policy. So it impacts how people treat each other in terms of how COVID is a great example, in terms of the facts related to the data related to COVID versus what the narrative that is dominant in the media. Sometimes they align, sometimes they don't. But people are basing their lives on what the media is telling us. And people haven't been, the media hasn't been careful to get their story right in the first place. And then people haven't been careful to verify what the media is telling them. Oftentimes because they're going to sources that are going to confirm versus inform. And I am as guilty as anyone in that. I have a certain political preference, and I can tell you that I will tend to look for my news from those sources that are going to confirm my biases versus those sources that are going to disrupt my perspective. But we have an obligation as Christians and as truth seekers to seek truth regardless of the source. And to be skeptical regardless of the source. So I think that's in terms of how these virtues or lack of virtues impact culture. I see it obviously in the media, but then the impact, the trickle or the ripple effect rather, is how it affects our public policy, and more practically how it affects how you and I live our lives. So so that would be a very practical example of how we see it in the culture. And let me make one other comment on that too, is the lack of virtue. If you don't have intellectual fair-mindedness, let's say, and we see a lack of fair-mindedness in our politicians regularly, it's impossible for people who lack fair-mindedness to have a healthy, fruitful discussion. Okay, to be able to debate, to be able to weigh the relative merits of an argument. Okay, and when you aren't fair-minded, and when you aren't tenacious, and you aren't careful, and there's a narrative that you need to promote, then it's impossible for a democracy to function well. It ceases. If you think about the contrast between, at least the stereotype or the vision that we have of the founding fathers getting together, and they have these day-long debates on a single topic, actually not day-long, but months-long, years-long debates, where the arguments are developed, and then there's a counter-argument. And then somehow they come up with the Constitution as a result of this listening to each other, actually listening to each other fair-mindedly, having the courage to ask tough questions, having the tenacity not to give up when it was the formation of the Constitution itself is a great example of some of these virtues, and how those virtues are essential for a healthy civic society. Today, what do our politics look like? Our politics look like shouting matches, and these are smart people. They aren't dumb people. You don't get to. Well, maybe that's not true. Generally speaking, politicians are people who have a good head on their shoulders. Okay, but they recognize that our society, our culture, is calling for. They want their constituents want red meat, regardless of what political bent they're from. And so they're going to give that to them. And that produces a lack of an inability to have a thoughtful civic political conversation.
And it seems too that the opposite is true, that when somebody does attempt to be thoughtful, to be fair-minded, it's sort of like there's a yawn factor there. Let's flip to the next talking head who's saying something extreme or something provocative. And I think it's important that you point out for those who are, and you would know far more about this than I do, but that even in penning the Constitution, it's not as if the founding fathers were all of one mind. There were incredible conflicts and barriers of differences of thinking that had to be overcome to reach that document.
And I would say too that the founding fathers were not intellectual saints either. They had their failings, they had their biases, they had their lack of virtue. But there does seem to be a difference in kind, or not kind, degree, between the types of virtues that they regularly practice and what we see in our popular culture today. And I think part of it is what you say. We are been trained to pursue what is the dramatic, the thing that's going to confirm what we already believe, whatever it is. We can switch the channel in a way that you can't switch a book. Like you're
right.
How we pursue knowledge today and our easy access to it leads us to a lack of ability to stick with a question for longer than a couple minutes. But there's one other big thing that I wanted to highlight too, and you alluded to it a second ago, is ultimately what does a society, what value does a society place on truth? And how does a society define truth? That's a substantial difference between even 100 years ago and today. There was an assumption that there was, even if we disagreed about what it was, there was an agreement that truth did exist.
Right.
And that we can debate and argue about it and have different perspectives and opinions. But at the end of the day, there is truth that does exist, and hopefully by our arguing and debating, we're going to help each other get closer to it. If you don't actually believe, if it's my truth can be different from your truth, that means that it's ultimately pointless to debate.
Right.
It's ultimately pointless to actually pursue the truth. So these virtues that we're talking about, there's no need to or incentive to develop these virtues if we already have everything that we have, because it's my truth.
Right.
And so there's a significant, until we actually believe that truth exists outside of ourselves, these virtues and all the things that are related to these virtues are going to be less. It's going to be harder for us to get to them.
Well, friends, that is all we have time for today. Philip and I had a very long conversation. It was very interesting, but we've decided to cut the video short and to bring the rest to you in a part 2. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Calvary Conversations, a service of Calvary University in Kansas City, Missouri. We invite you to participate in the conversation by contacting us through the Calvary University website, calvary.edu, or by calling us at 816-322-0110. Join us again next week for another Calvary Conversation.